Molek was just a noun that referred to a specific type of offering, usually one that involved the sacrifice of a child. And I would argue one of the reasons that it became so popular to understand this as a reference to a deity who was the recipient of those child sacrifices is because it effectively masked the likely original intended recipient of those sacrifices on the part of Israelites.
All right, let's see it.
Oh, that's my line! That's my line! That's my line! That's my line!
Namely, the God of Israel. And we see this commanded in Exodus 22, verse 29, and it's in the Hebrew, it's verse 28. But that commandment would later be renegotiated, either to understand it as a reference to handing over firstborn sons to priestly service, or to require the redemption of the child by using an animal as a proxy. But we can see other authors acknowledging that original intended purpose of that commandment in, for instance, Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 25, where Ezekiel acknowledges that God commanded Israel to sacrifice their children, but did so as a means of desolating Israel, basically to show them who's boss.
So I disagree with Dan here. Basically, what he is arguing is that the Torah had at one point contained laws for Israel to sacrifice their firstborn children to the God of Israel, but that these laws were later reinterpreted. In other words, the laws concerning the redemption of the firstborn must have replaced these earlier laws about sacrificing children to the God of Israel, and Dan thinks that these child sacrifice laws were the quote-unquote not good decrees that are mentioned in Ezekiel 20, 25 through 26. In this video, I want to focus specifically on the passage in Ezekiel. Does Ezekiel acknowledge that God at one time commanded Israel to sacrifice their children to him? Frankly, Dan's interpretation of this text strikes me as contrived and a little conspiratorial. For a better interpretation of the textual data, see this paper from Kelvin Freebell. As Freebell argues, in Ezekiel 20, 25 through 26, the author is not referring to laws that God gave to Israel to obey. This is obvious by the fact that throughout the chapter, the text makes a sharp distinction between God's laws that he gave at Sinai for his people to obey and these quote-unquote not good decrees in verse 25. For instance, the text states that God's laws at Sinai are life-giving, but the decrees referenced in verse 25 are said not to give life. Furthermore, when decrees is used elsewhere in the same chapter to refer to God's laws given at Sinai, it is in the feminine plural, but in verse 25, the word decrees is in the masculine plural. Finally, throughout this chapter, God refers to his laws as my statutes and my rules, but God does not say my decrees when he refers to the not good decrees in verse 25. He just calls them decrees. Again, these differences, which all occur within the same literary unit, indicate that the text makes a distinction between the commands given by God at Sinai and the quote-unquote not good decrees from verse 25. In other words, the decrees from verse 25 are not the laws that God gave his people to obey, and they certainly are not a reference to some secret, hidden child sacrifice laws that were later reinterpreted by the Israelites, but more on that in a moment. So, what are these not good decrees referring to? Well, first, throughout the chapter, the author is recounting Israel's history of rebellion. Verses 25 through 26 are in the context of recounting the rebellion of the second generation of Israelites in the wilderness. That is the generation who received these quote-unquote not good decrees. With that in mind, the key to unlocking the meaning of this passage is in the previous verses. In verse 23, God vowed to scatter Israel among the nations as a judgment for their rejection of his laws. Notice the structural link between verses 23 through 24 and verses 25 through 26. Both begin with I also. As Freebell notes, this link literarily highlights the structural interconnectedness of these verses. He points out that this repetition can be understood as a literary device indicating a resumption of the subject of verse 23. As Freebell writes, quote, as a resumptive repetition, verse 25 would refer to that specific oath of judgment in verse 23. Clearly, that decree of judgment in verse 23 is not to the people's benefit. In other words, it is not good. Rather, it is essentially a declaration of death for the nation. In other words, it is not life-giving. So, this vow of judgment in verse 23 seems to be what the not good decrees in verse 25 are referring to, This judgment pronounced in verse 23 is not good. It is a decree of death, not life, because Israel has rejected God's commandments. That is to say, the not good decrees of Ezekiel 20:25 are not God's laws, but instead God's decrees of judgment upon Israel for breaking his laws. Remember, Moses warned the second generation of Israelites in the wilderness that if they rejected God's commandments, it would result in death. He also said that they would be scattered among the nations. It should also be noted that the word translated regulations in this verse is used elsewhere in Ezekiel to refer to judgment for sin. So again, the not good decrees from verse 25 were not laws that God expected his people to keep, but rather the judgments that God declared over his people for breaking his laws. Contrary to Dan's opinion, in verse 25, the text does not say that God ever commanded his people to do bad things like sacrifice their children. It says that God issued harsh judgments upon the people because of their sins. But what about the next verse, which clearly references child sacrifice? It says that God declared Israel to be defiled because of these sacrifices. Were the Israelites sacrificing their children to the God of Israel? Well, no, not according to the context. Throughout the chapter, the prophet condemns Israel for defiling themselves with idols. Everywhere else the word defile appears in this chapter, it is used in reference to worshiping idols. The primary criticism of Israel throughout this entire literary unit is Israel's idolatry. Also, note the striking parallel just a few verses later. Here, in verse 31, we see that the practice of offering up children in fire is part of worshiping idols, and that this practice defiles Israel. So, in verse 26, when the text states that God declared Israel defiled because of their child sacrifice, he must be referring to their sacrificing of their children to idols, not sacrificing their children to the God of Israel. Apparently, at least according to Ezekiel, some Israelites among the second generation in the wilderness had engaged in this idolatrous practice, despite the explicit prohibitions against child sacrifice in the Torah. So, because of their sin, God gave them not good decrees of judgment by which they could not have life. He declared them defiled because they sacrificed their children to idols. God gave Israel this decree of death and declared them defiled in order to devastate them so that they would come to know the Lord. Again, if you are interested in this topic, I highly recommend Freebell's paper, which goes into much more depth. Here is his paraphrase of Ezekiel 20:25-26. And also I gave them decrees regarding their dispersion and scattering that were not good, and judgments of punishment by which they would not have life. And I declared them defiled on account of their gifts to their idols, on account of offering by fire to idols all their firstborn, so that I would cause them to be horrified, so that they would know that I am Yahweh. Alright, I hope you guys found that helpful. Hey everyone, thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to see more content like this, I want to invite you to subscribe to my channel. Also, don't forget to hit that little bell so that you'll be notified when new videos like this are released. One last thing, be sure to connect with me on my website, davidwilber.com. There you can find a ton of free resources like articles and videos. You can learn more about the books that I've written. Also, if God has put it on your heart, there is an opportunity to throw a couple bucks my way to support my work. Again, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.